The Texas-based multinational energy company Kinder Morgan has announced that they are suspending all non-essential spending on its Trans Mountain expansion pipeline, and they are threatening to cancel it if they fail to reach an agreement with BC and other stakeholders over how to proceed. Now, this is fantastic news, and the delay and potential cancellation of this pipeline is largely due to protests by Indigenous leaders and activists. And those protests got even more exposure thanks to writers and activists like Naomi Klein and Green Party leader Elizabeth May, who was recently arrested at a protest. Now let me try and give you a brief overview of the politics that's been happening around the construction of this pipeline. So in British Columbia, you have an NDP government led by John Horgan. And in Alberta, you also have an NDP government led by Rachel Notley. Now, while both of these provinces are led by an NDP government, they are on opposite sides of what they should do with this pipeline. So, as it's been alluded to in the story here, the BC NDP are against the construction of this pipeline, while the Alberta NDP and Rachel Notley are for the construction. Now, a part of that reason is because in Alberta, they are heavily invested in the oil and gas industry, while in BC, the Green Party there, led by Andrew Weaver, holds the balance of power. So because of that pressure from the Green Party and the need to have the Green Party on their side, John Horgan has appealed to the Green Party in order to keep his hold on the government there. So there is all this politics happening behind the scenes. And in addition to that, we have Justin Trudeau, who also wants to see the construction of this pipeline, even though he ran on a platform of acting like he was, going to enact some changes to help with climate change. And while in some ways you can say he has been a little better than the previous government led by Stephen Harper, he still is not where he should be. Now, before I get even deeper on this, let me show you or give you a comment from Kinder Morgan Limited on this news. As Kinder Morgan Limited has repeatedly stated, we will be judicious in our use of shareholder funds. In keeping with that commitment, we have determined that in the current environment, we will not put KML shareholders at risk on the remaining project spend, said KML Chairman and CEO Steve Keen. If we cannot reach agreement by May 31st, it is difficult to conceive of any scenario in which we would proceed with the project. The remarks came one day after a protest by Indigenous leaders and environmental activists drove the company to suspend activities for the day. Close to 200 people have been arrested at the site of a Kinder Morgan terminal in the Metro Vancouver suburb of Burnaby, BC, in an attempt to stop construction activity from proceeding. Now, what this shows you is that protesting works, and it's especially helpful if you have a party like the BC Greens holding the balance of power in British Columbia that is also on the side of the protesters and have helped to prevent the construction of this pipeline. So whether you are an activist and you are out there on the front lines actually, protesting against this pipeline, or you're simply a Green Party voter in British Columbia where they are viable, then you are on the side of helping to make change happen. Now, if this Trans Mountain expansion pipeline were to be constructed, it would dramatically increase oil tanker traffic off the coast of BC. So you can understand why the BC Greens and environmentalists are against it. Now, there is another important detail of this story that is kind of told through Twitter. But first, I want to give you some reaction from Twitter. So here is educator and activist Bill McKibben tweeting out, "Wait, this news is still very fresh, but it appears that non-violent campaigning by First Nations and others may have stopped a giant tar sands pipeline, at least for now. If so, a huge win for planet Earth." And this from Ricochet editor Derek O'Keefe. Trudeau, Notley, and the corporate pundits will spend the next weeks hyperventilating about how Kinder Morgan's pipeline is in Canada's national interest. Don't let anyone buy this spin. It's only in the interests of big oil and a Texas multinational corporation. And that's exactly what they're doing. Case in point, Justin Trudeau's tweet here. Canada is a country of the rule of law, and the federal government will act in the national interest. Access to world markets for Canadian resources is a core national interest. The Trans Mountain expansion will be built. Now that tweet from Trudeau leads me to a response from Naomi Klein where she mentions a detail that I want to talk about. So here's her response. What about the treaties being violated all over Alberta? What about UN DRIP, which you campaigned on and have violated repeatedly? What about the Paris Climate Accord you helped negotiate and are mocking? These are also legal documents. Your national interest is a crime scene. Now, that hashtag UN DRIP that Naomi Klein mentioned there is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and according to the UN's website, it establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world, and it elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to the specific situation of indigenous peoples. Now, while it's a non-binding agreement, the UN Declaration can be applied to the Trans Mountain expansion, with the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs saying that Canada is violating the UN Indigenous right to pipelines consent. According to UN DRIP, quote, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories. Now, the Canadian government is claiming that they did provide proper consultations, but the Indigenous peoples and the pipeline opponents are claiming that they, in fact, did not provide meaningful consultation, and that the Canadian government was simply trying to get approvals through to get this pipeline constructed. Now, what this whole story shows me is just the serious disconnect between the Liberal government and the Alberta NDP and environmental issues. So, especially in the case of Rachel Notley's NDP in Alberta. Now, I understand that they are heavily invested in the oil and gas industry, but at the same time, the NDP is supposed to be on the left side of this issue. They're supposed to be aware of environmental issues and doing everything they can to stop the destruction of the planet. But in this case, they are propping up business interests over the interests of the environment. Now, I don't want to be too down right now because this is actually ultimately good news. So this pipeline has been delayed, potentially canceled, but we'll have to see or wait until May 31st to see how this all unfolds. Hey, if you like this video, hit that subscribe button below and consider throwing me a few bucks on Patreon at patreon.com/therationalnational or therationalnational.com/join.